In the weeks following Finn and Hope's exile, the sudden hush that fell over Los Angeles felt as hollow as the unspoken tension between everyone who had survived the tempest of betrayal. Liam, freed from the agonies of Steffi's courtroom vindication, but tormented by his own guilt over Kelly's death, tried to piece his life back together in the quiet sanctuary of his home, where the walls still echoed with laughter that would never return. He knew that he was not healed, not by a long shot. The prescription painkillers prescribed for his fractured ribs and concussion did little to numb the memory of his daughter's final cries, and every time he closed his eyes he saw the sunlight glancing off Kelly's golden hair as she turned to him with that innocent grin, the one that had broken his heart all over again the instant the car rolled. Hope, once his confidant and co-conspirator, now hovered by his side in a daze of grief so deep it left her mute. She tended to his wounds and administered his medication with trembling hands, but her own wounds lay too close to her heart to ever let him forget what they had lost. Meanwhile, across town, Steffi Forrester carried her own burden of grief and rage, a complex tangle of emotions so fierce that it threatened to tear her apart at the seams. From the moment the phone call came, Finn's voice hushed, urgent, fractured by shock. She had raced to the hospital, her heels clicking on the marble floors like the ticking of an ominous clock. When she arrived, she found Liam slumped on a gurney, tubes snaking from his arms, his face pale and coated in sweat. Beside him lay the lifeless body of Kelly, carefully draped and covered by a white sheet that no loving mother could ever bear to see again. The doctors and nurses gave Steffi only a brief window to say goodbye. To her friend, yes, but mostly to the child who had been the embodiment of hope and new beginnings, and in that moment, Steffi felt her entire world constrict to the two lives stretched out before her, one hanging by a thread, the other gone forever. Though her fury at Hope still smoldered beneath her skin, Steffi did not hesitate to enlist Hope's help in caring for Liam. She recognized that despite their enmity, Hope remained his only link to the daughter he had lost, and in that fractured bond lay the only thread strong enough to tether him to the will to live. In the sterile hospital room, the three of them gathered, Liam unconscious, Hope clutching his hand, Steffi standing sentinel, each playing a part in a tragedy none of them could have scripted, each bound by grief, guilt, and a shared recognition that life would never be the same again. As the days bled into one another, Steffi found herself pulled in opposing directions by the fierce instincts of her heart. On one hand, she was the Forrester heiress, the indomitable force who had faced down betrayal and emerged victorious. On the other, she was a woman shattered by loss, haunted by Kelly's empty crib and the cruel knowledge that no amount of sumptuous fabric or glittering runway lights could stitch her spirit back together. She spent hours at Liam's bedside, smoothing the hair from his fevered brow, whispering his name as if the sound of it could awaken him from the nightmare that held him captive. When he stirred, confused and in pain, Steffi was there to calm him, to remind him that despite everything he had endured, and despite the part he had unknowingly played in Kelly's death, he was not beyond redemption. Hope, too fragile to stand alone, found refuge in Steffi's steadiness. Despite their history, she now looked to Steffi with a mixture of gratitude and shame, her tears a silent plea for forgiveness that Steffi had not yet decided whether to grant. Yet in those moments of shared sorrow, a new, grudging respect began to grow between them. Both women had loved the same man, both had lost everything that had once defined them, and both now faced the same terrifying question. Could they summon the strength to survive a pain so raw it seemed to sever the soul? But the greatest blow came not from the hospital walls, but from within Steffi's own body. Weeks earlier, she had discovered that she was pregnant, a bittersweet revelation that had filled her with a flicker of hope even as her heart ached with the memory of her lost child. She had confided only in Liam, clinging to the fragile promise of new life as a counterpoint to the ghosts that haunted her. Now, however, the relentless stress and grief of Kelly's death and the long nights spent vigil by Liam's side proved too much for her. One afternoon, as she sat beside Hope, who was resting on a narrow cot in the corner, Steffi felt a sudden crushing pain in her abdomen, so fierce it brought her to her knees. The world spun, and as she lost consciousness, the last thing she saw was Hope's panicked face rushing toward her. By the time she awoke, the doctors stood over her with solemn expressions. The baby, too, had been lost. Steffi's scream echoed through the empty corridor like a cry of a warrior unmoored, a heart rent in two by the cruelest of ironies. She had fought to save a dying man and to bring new life into the world, only to lose both in a single, merciless sweep. In the sterile glare of the hospital lighting, she felt all her defenses crumble. The carefully crafted armor of strength she had worn for so long lay in shattered pieces at her feet. It was in this hollow moment, as she lay bleeding and bereft on the gurney, that she understood the full scope of her anguish. She had lost her unborn child. She had witnessed the death of an innocent. And she faced the possible loss of the man she had once considered her greatest love. The cruel math of tragedy seemed to dictate that one more heartbreak would finish her, one more blow to a woman who had already given everything. Now, as the sun set beyond the city's skyline and the hospital grew quiet, Steffi sat alone in the dimly lit room, her gaze fixed on the empty bassinet that stood vigil in the corner. The echoes of every footstep, every whispered conversation, every tear that had fallen within these walls swirled around her like a chorus of ghosts. She knew, deep in her bones, that she stood at a precipice. Either she would find some remnant of hope in the wreckage, some spark that would ignite her will to rebuild, or she would be consumed by the shadows of grief, her story ending not in triumph, but in tragedy. Liam's fate remained uncertain, his body still weakened by the accident, his spirit teetering between despair and the will to live. Steffi, grief-stricken, battered, and unable even to shed tears for fear that none would come, must decide whether to fight for the man she once loved, to survive the psychological cataclysm that threatened to claim her, or to let the weight of loss extinguish her spark forever. And as the hospital corridor stretched out into silence, and the lights flickered with the promise of another sleepless night, the question hung in the air like a promise or a threat. Would Steffi Forrester rise from this abyss? Or would she be forced to endure yet another unbearable loss? This time, the death of Liam himself? Cornered by the looming threat of exposure and desperate to halt the collapse of everything she has built, Grace Forrester sat in the dim glow of her private study, the flicker of candlelight dancing across her tense features. Every whispered accusation, every rumor swirling around her involvement in the sabotage at Forrester Creations weighed on her conscience like a leaden chain. She knew that if the truth ever came to light, if Ridge, Steffi, Liam, or worse, anyone in the Finnegan or Spencer families discovered her role in the conspiracy, her carefully curated empire would crumble. So when the call came in the dead of night, reporting that Finn had begun to question the forged documents and mysterious delays that sabotaged his relationship with Steffi, Grace's breath caught in her throat. Fear, cold and unrelenting, gripped her heart. She could not allow Finn's suspicions to unravel her entire scheme. With a shaking hand, she tapped out orders to her most trusted associates. Find him, lure him away, and keep him silent until she could stage an accident or declare him missing for good. The words "abduct Dr. Finnegan" fell from her lips like a death sentence, sealing the fate of the man who had once been a beacon of integrity in her world. Within hours, Finn vanished without a trace, leaving behind an empty apartment and a single, crumpled note scrawled in haste. "I promise I'll explain when I return." But the promise was a lie born of panic, and as dawn broke across the Los Angeles skyline, a dark cloud settled over the Finnegan family, threatening to shatter what remained of their fragile peace. Meanwhile, Steffi Forrester awoke to a storm of grief and rage when Ridge's frantic call reached her at sunrise. Finn was missing. The news struck her like a physical blow, reopening every wound left by recent betrayals and tragedies. Only months ago, she had endured the agony of losing her unborn child, the collapse of her marriage, and the bitter custody battles that left her reeling. Now, the man she had once loved more fiercely than any other simply vanished. Despite the ache of her own scars and the resentment still flickering between her and Hope Logan, Steffi threw herself into the crisis. She knew that beneath the shock and fury, beneath the lingering wounds, lay an unbreakable bond forged by years of love and loyalty to Finn. She contacted Ridge, whose protective fury matched her own, and they enlisted Liam Spencer, a reluctant ally hardened by his own recent losses, to form an impromptu rescue team. They pulled every fragment of information, the voicemails, the citywide security footage, the whispered sightings of a pale-faced man bundled into a black SUV. Their search led them to the outskirts of Los Angeles, to a long-abandoned medical facility once used for experimental treatments. Overgrown vines crawled up its crumbling facade, shattered windows gaped like skeletal sockets, and graffiti proclaimed it territory claimed by forgotten ghosts. This was the place where Grace's hired goons kept Finn, sedated and bound, his steadfast spirit dulled by injections intended to keep his mind pliable. Under the cover of darkness, Steffi, Ridge, and Liam crept through the shattered archway, flashlights slicing through the mildew-scented air. Every echo of their footsteps seemed to reverberate with urgency, every shadow a potential threat. Memories of happier days flickered through Steffi's mind, the walks they had shared on the beach, Finn's reassuring smile as he welcomed her into his medical world, but now those memories were tainted by fear for his life. Ridge clenched his jaw, scanning the derelict hallways for signs of movement, while Liam's hand hovered over the gun at his side, eyes darting ahead in trust and vigilance. At the end of a long corridor, they found a locked door, its rusted hinges groaning in protest as Steffi forced it open. Inside, Finn lay strapped to an operating table, medical drips feeding into his veins, his face pale and drawn. He stirred at the sound of his wife's voice. Her name, a whisper on his cracked lips that brought color back into his cheeks with the force of relief. But before they could untie him, the scrape of boots sounded from the stairwell. Grace's henchmen, alerted by Grace's frantic orders, were closing in fast, their silhouettes swallowed by the gloom before the rescue team sprang into action. A vicious scuffle erupted in the narrow room, fists and flashlights colliding, adamantine wills tested in a bid for control. Ridge tackled one thug to the ground, his designer suit torn at the cuff, while Liam disarmed another with a swift strike. Steffi fought not with the measured grace of a supermodel, but with the fierce desperation of a woman who would risk her life for love. She yanked the restraints from Finn's arms as the final goon lunged for them. Finn, drawing on the last reserves of his strength, grabbed the attacker's arm and twisted until the man released him, crumpling to the floor groaning. Within seconds, the trio had gained the upper hand. They dragged Finn from the table, his legs trembling as he struggled to stand. There was no time for hesitation or regret. Every second they stayed could bring reinforcements. Liam led the way, blanket-draped Finn supported by Steffi's one arm and Ridge's other, their footsteps splashing through puddles of stagnant water as they retreated down the corridor toward a gaping hole in the wall they had pried open earlier. They burst into the night air, cold and intoxicating, where Liam's car idled at the edge of the property line. Steffi eased Finn into the back seat, pressing a trembling hand to his forehead to gauge his fever. Ridge covered the rearview mirror with a tattered cloth to block any tail, and they sped away, engines roaring like battle cries. Sirens wailed in the distance, fading as they barreled down the deserted highway toward the hospital where Grace could not reach them. Finn's breathing was ragged, his pulse weak. Steffi recalled the doctor's admonitions about the lingering effects of the drugs they had pumped into him. She unbuttoned his shirt to check for injection sites, her fingers tracing the bruises along his collarbone, transfixed by the sight of his vulnerability. "You're safe now," she murmured, her voice thick with tears and relief. "We've got you." Finn closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, the sound of the racing engine beneath them a lullaby of survival. By dawn, the rescue team had led Finn straight into the arms of medical staff who rushed him into emergency care. As the doctors worked to purge his system of the sedatives and treat the deep abrasions, Steffi and Ridge stood vigil outside the operating theater, their shoulders brushing in silent solidarity. Liam paced the corridor, replaying the rescue in his mind, already drafting the narrative he would share with the authorities. They possessed evidence now, photographs of the abandoned facility, recordings of threatening messages sent by Grace's operatives, Finn's own memory of Grace's name whispered before he lost consciousness. With these, they would dismantle Grace's empire, expose her crimes, and ensure justice for every life she had endangered, beginning with Finn's. In the days that followed, Grace's reign of terror collapsed under the weight of irrefutable proof. Prosecutors moved swiftly to charge her with conspiracy, kidnapping, and assault, and she was taken into custody in a scene as stark as it was inevitable, flanked by officers, her designer gloves and impeccable hair undone by the sudden realization that privilege and power could not shield her from the consequences of her deeds. The courtroom drama was televised, every gasp, every revelation laid bare for the world to witness. And through it all, Steffi, Finn, Ridge, and even Liam, drawn together by the crucible of crisis, stood united in the public gallery, their faces etched with the residue of fear and relief. When the gavel finally fell, sentencing Grace to years behind bars, there was no triumphant gloating, only a collective exhale and the shared understanding that their victory had been hard-won. As the long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the city, Finn emerged from the courtroom on crutches, leaning on Steffi's arm and supported by Ridge's protective presence. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence on the courthouse steps, the press swarming at their feet, the cameras flashing like salvos of sunlight. Finn looked at Steffi, gratitude and love shining in his eyes despite the bruises darkening his skin. Steffi offered him a smile, worn but unwavering, as Ridge placed a reassuring hand on Finn's shoulder. In that instant, the wounds of the past seemed to soften. The betrayals, the heartbreaks, the lingering resentments, they all receded in the warmth of triumph and the promise of a new beginning. And so, with Grace Forrester's crimes laid bare and her power extinguished, a new era dawned for the Finnegan family. In the weeks that followed, Steffi and Finn returned to their home, scarred by the trauma they had endured, but standing resolute as a testament to love's resilience. Steffi redecorated Finn's study in softer hues, hung family photographs from happier times on the walls, and prepared nourishing meals to strengthen his body and soul. Ridge visited often, offering guidance and a protective when Finn's confidence wavered, while Liam, healed as much as he could be from his own losses, reclaimed his role as Finn's fiercest ally, a testament to the bonds forged in adversity. Together, they began the slow process of rebuilding what had been nearly destroyed, not just a marriage, not just a family business, but the fragile architecture of hope itself. Forgiveness, once a distant shore, beckoned them forward, its light shimmering on the horizon of their shared future. And although the scars of the past would forever mark their journey, Steffi, Finn, Ridge, and Liam stepped into this new chapter fortified by the knowledge that no darkness, no matter how deep, could extinguish the healing power of love and the unwavering determination of those who refuse to let go of one another.